Good evening. Our speaker tonight is Nora Ephron, who I've known only half of my adult life and all of her adult life. As you all know, her most famous moment was giving a role of an extra to my daughter Hallie Pfeiffer in her wonderful movie, You've Got Mail. For those of you who remember You've Got Mail with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, it was an adaptation of a brilliant Ernst Lubitsch film. And Lubitsch was a great and perhaps the most original early comic filmmaker of the 1930s of silence. And what he established in film comedies at the time was a sense of unique urban wit and style. And Nora has been an example of style in all of the films she's worked in and all of her working life. And when we first met, when she was a journalist, she established herself very, very quickly, first in newspapers and then as a remarkable series of articles in various magazines, notably Esquire, on just about every diverse subject you can think of. She made the personal political and the political personal, and the thoughtful entertaining. And that was the gift that very few actually have, that whatever subject she took, she made you always feel that she was talking directly to you, and she was talking about things that concerned her and concerned you, and she made it immediately intimate and surprisingly, considering so many of the subjects, witty. And she's carried this on into a film career of her first film, the name of which I can never get right but I love so much. This Is My Life. I keep thinking it's the story of my life, which was about a would-be stand-up comic, and done with such charm and reality in terms of the family. It was the first film, and it showed such a level of all of the things that she's always had in her other work, and she's gone on with to do when she wrote that as a screenplay, Harry Met Sally, which she now tells me is being done as a play in many parts of the world, and she's about to be done in Japan, and I wondered how the orgasm scene would sound. But in any case, Nora's work in everything she's done has been remarkably consistent in intelligence. Her film, her book, Heartbreak, and the film adapted from that by Mike Nichols was one of the first, after a long period of time, of awful comedies, teenage comedies and dopey comedies. I remember seeing that film and said, oh my God, what's went wrong? It's a grown-up comedy. It's a comedy for people of my generation, for people like me. And she's been writing for people like me forever and directing like people like me forever, and here she is for you this very night. Thank you. Nora Ephron.
Thank you. That was really a nice introduction. I hope I remember it. I'm sorry I didn't see Jules speak the other night, but I had to go to New York so that all my appliances in East Hampton would break. And thank you for coming. I hope to be coherent tonight. I always have a pathological fear about doing this sort of thing because when I was in college, I used to go to things like this where writers would speak, and I would always hope that they would tell me some fabulous secret that would make it possible for me to be a writer. And they never did tell me anything useful at all, as I recall. And then at my graduation, I remember sitting there, as you do at your college graduation, terrified that nothing would become of me, that I would move to New York and never meet anyone and never get a job and end up being one of those people you read about who die and eventually weeks later someone notices because the smell drifts out into the hallway. And there was a woman writer speaking at my college graduation. His name was Santha Rama Rao. And I sat there thinking, okay, Santha, this is it. This is my last chance for a really great secret. And she spoke about the need to put friendship over love of country, which had never crossed my mind one way or another. So anyway, I don't have any secrets for you, although I will tell you one thing. That riff I just did about the dead body and the smell going out into the hallway is in When Harry Met Sally. So here is a true thing. It's probably the only thing I'm going to tell you is that writers waste nothing. Every thought you have, if you are good, you can get it into print, you can use it somehow, write down everything that crosses your mind. Anyway, I thought I would talk a little bit about how I became a writer, and hope that that would do it, frankly. And one of the things I was thinking of, but I won't carry this through all the way, or I will be here forever. But there's a game that we sometimes play when we're stuck in a bar waiting for a table in a restaurant, and you have to write down the 5 things that describe who you are, and you know, I just thought I'd start out by telling you a little about who I was anyway. And when I was young, as some of you in this room are, when I was in my 20s, I would have written girl, because you know, we were girls when we were in our 20s back then. I was a reporter. I was a New Yorker. I was married. It would never have occurred to me that I would not be most of those things forever, just as it would never have occurred to me that the list of things that I wanted in a husband wasn't immutable. You know, I had this, I'm sure some of you have had this list that you wrote down that had things like, mine said Democrat, plays bridge. You know, I have been married 3 times. I have never married a bridge player, but it was on my list, must play bridge. Anyway, so I was a girl, and I had gone to Wellesley College, and it was a period before almost anything that we know of had happened, and when I started at Wellesley, I'm just doing some of this for the women because, you know, it's women's stuff. When I started at Wellesley, there was an article in the Harvard Crimson about all the women's colleges, and each of them was basically, you know, just totally destroyed by some unbelievably oversimplified characterization. And Wellesley women were girls. We were girls. Forgot that. They were called tunicata. The tunicata, it said in the Harvard Crimson, were fish that spent the first part of their life swimming madly around the ocean floor, examining their surroundings, and then the rest of their lives just lying there breeding. And even then we were smart enough to be insulted by this, but there was a horrible truth to it when I was in college. We really were supposed to marry our lives, and if you were interested in medicine, you were supposed to marry a doctor. We were going to college so that we would someday be fabulous enough to sit at the head of a table at a dinner party and point out the remarkable similarities between the arguments 2 brilliant men were making. And you know, we were put on the earth to make nice and raise money for hospitals. And when I went back to my, I think, 25th college reunion, one of my classmates stood up and said, "The saddest thing," she said, "our education was a dress rehearsal for a life we never led." It was very, you know, it was right before the women's movement. And And it really was a shock to all of the people I went to college with. Not to me, because I will tell you I was lucky for one reason, but it was a shock when so many of them found themselves on their own, found that they really needed to get a job, to make money, to have a career, all the things they had never thought about. Many of them had gotten teaching credentials because teaching was something to fall back on in case you didn't get married, in case, God forbid, you got divorced. But I was really saved from the fate of marrying my career by my mother, who had a career. She was, in fact, the only career woman that I knew growing up in Beverly Hills, California. She was a screenwriter with my father. And she had 4 daughters and raised us all, and we all knew that the answer to the question, what are you going to be when you grow up, was not get married and have children. You could do that, of course, but what were you going to do? What were you going to work at? And it was one of the great things she gave all 4 of us. I had been born in New York and had been rudely uprooted by my parents when I was 5 because they went to California to write movies. And in fact, my first memory of Los Angeles, this is so clear, is that I'm at nursery school at a school on Doheny Drive in Beverly Hills, and the sun is shining. It's the most beautiful day, and there's little, dappled shadows everywhere and happy, laughing blonde children, and all I can think is, what am I doing here? It was just, I've got to get out. A terrible mistake has been made. And I was going to get out. I was certainly not going to be a screenwriter because my mother was a screenwriter. So that just goes to show how hard it is not to become your mother. I was going to be something wildly different. I was going to be a journalist. And I had fallen in, it was as if I thought it was as rebellious as deciding to be a shoemaker or something. I was going to live in New York and work on a newspaper, and I was as, I could not wait. It was partly reading Brenda Starr and watching Superman on television with Lois Lane, and I had a great journalism teacher, and I always tell this story because he was a great teacher named Charles O. Sims, and I'm always looking for him on Yahoo, but I can never find him. He was a darling man. He had been in the Olympics, the 1956 Olympics, as a gymnast, and was now teaching journalism at Beverly Hills High School. And our first day of class, he got up in front of the class and did what most journalism teachers do for the first couple of months that you study journalism, which is that he taught us to write a lead. And I'm sure many of you have taken this course where they write on the board who, what, where, when, why, and how. And and in one way or another, you are presented with some facts and you have to put them into a lead. And he explained to us about what a lead was and how you would get the reader's attention and blah, 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 blah. So then he dictated a set of facts to us, and I'll tell you approximately what those facts were. He said something like this: Kenneth L. Peters, the principal of Beverly Hills High School, announced today that the faculty of the high school will travel to Sacramento on Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Speaking there will be Dr. Harold Taylor, the president of Sarah Lawrence College, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. So we all sat at our typewriters and we basically inverted that thing so that it said something like Robert Maynard Hutchins and Dr. Harold Taylor will address the faculty on Thursday in Sacramento. Kenneth L. Peters announced today, something like that. And we all turned it in. And Mr. Sims looked at all of us and he said, the lead to the story is there will be no school Thursday. And it was that, it was the cartoon light bulb moment. It was the most exciting thing. I was just galvanized, energized, thrilled, because I thought, oh, it's about the point. It's about the point. And everything he did in that class was a version. Just told you, every single set of facts he gave us had something in it that you had to figure out, so that when we got to writing about basketball, you had to look down in the box scores to see that a 19-game winning streak had been snapped. Things like that. It was constant. It was like sort of a combination of detective work and math, and there was an answer in some fabulous way, and of course there was also the kind of fantastic idea that one was serving the truth, and you get very hooked on the truth and about true events. And of course this became even more so when I became a newspaper reporter. I worked at the New York Post. I would like to say in the old days, but the New York Post is one of those places that everyone was always saying it used to be better. When I worked there, it had used to be better, or it used to be better, and now, of course, everyone who works there will tell you it used to be better. But it was a great place to work, and I covered everything. I covered murders, and I covered trials, and I covered famous people and not particularly famous people who wanted to be famous, and writers, and they based, heat waves, you name it. I got to write about it, and I got that thing that a lot of journalists get, which is a kind of awe at real life and at the kind of thing that you always say when you're a journalist, which is, who could make this up? Who could ever make up anything this insane, ludicrous, astonishing, horrible, whatever it is? You do become sort of fascinated by that, and by the idea that you can figure out what happened and tell people what happened. And I thought I had the best job in the world, and that I would do it forever and ever and ever, and would never, ever get bored. But of course, after 5 years at the Post, I was ready to kill myself. But the thing I want to say that was great about the Post, one of the things that was so lucky for me, and I always say this to people who are starting out as writers, is the Post was a daily paper. So it meant that you wrote something and it wrapped the fish. We all knew that. We all knew that what we were writing was not for posterity, that it was just, we weren't even the main thing people were reading every day. Almost everyone who buys the New York Post then and now buys another newspaper so they can find out what actually happened. And so you learn not to think that every word you wrote was, going to be, looked up in some annal ever. In fact, they've all, you almost can't even get it now. But, my stuff, I guess it's on microfilm somewhere, but by the time I left the Post after 5 years, my clips were falling apart in the morgue. But the point is this, that I started out, they knew I was a kid with a lot of energy, and they brought me along. They didn't give me assignments when I started out that were difficult. I never wrote anything at the New York Post my first year there that was more than about 600 words long. That's nothing, that's like just a little over 2 typed double-spaced pages. Sometimes not even that long. And it took me a long time to learn how to write at greater length. But fortunately, they didn't ask me to write at greater length because they knew I didn't know how to write at greater length. I was there for over a year before I wrote anything that was about 1,500 words long. And by then, I had started to understand in a very instinctive way one of the most important things you have to understand as a writer of anything, which is when the beginning ought to begin to end and the middle ought to begin, and when the middle ought to start to end and the end should start to begin. Beginning, middle, end. These are things that become very instinctive for you as a writer, but they weren't at all instinctive for me when I started out. Now, I know there are people who probably, from the very beginning, like Joan Didion or Norman Mailer or someone who were just gifted journalists straight out of the box, didn't need to work at a newspaper all that time or have that much training, but I did. And I remember, I will never forget, I don't know how many of you in this room remember the famous Star of India robbery at the Museum of Natural History, but a man named Murph the Surf and several other of his cohorts dropped into the museum through a trapdoor in the roof or something and managed to get this diamond out. And the Post sent me after they were arrested, the Post sent me to the hotel where they were staying to write a story about what they'd been up to in the weeks before they did the robbery. And I got very lucky at that hotel. I had the sense to know that they were probably living high, so I went to the top floor, and the first bell I rang, I got their next door neighbors who had hung out with them for weeks and knew everything about them. So I got this great story, and I came back to the Post. It was about 7 o'clock at night. I had to write for the next day. And I had all this material, and I had no idea how to organize it. I'd been at the Post maybe 5 months. And I remember just typing and retyping and knowing I didn't know how to construct that kind of story. I just didn't know the language for it. I knew how to write a kind of little feature, but I didn't know how to do this. And the next morning when I came into work, my story had been rewritten by one of the rewrite men at the Post, and his byline was on it along with mine. And I read his story, and I thought, oh, that's how you do that. Oh, I see. I mean, it was like a writing lesson. I didn't even feel mortified. They weren't even mad at me. They knew that it was a complicated story and that I probably didn't know how to write it. But the point is that I was so very lucky to be at a place where they knew I was starting out. They paid me nothing. So I was worth what they were paying me, which actually, just for historic sake, was $98 a week. And eventually I got better, and eventually I began to write magazines pieces, and eventually I left the New York Post. And now I was in my 30s, and not one thing I would have put on my list in my 20s was there any longer. I certainly wasn't a girl anymore. I was a woman, because the women's movement had come along, and I knew that we were not girls. And I was a feminist, and I was a magazine writer, and I was single, also known as divorced. And I was also funny. Now, I don't mean that I was not funny when I was in my 20s. I mean that sometimes being funny in life and managing to make it work on the page are two very different things. And it took me a long time before I knew how to do that, before I had enough confidence to do it. And I almost began to wonder whether it isn't almost I mean, this is just being narcissistic probably, but I sort of thought it was almost like a Piaget stage, that it's very, I know that there are kids in college who are constantly being assigned to write essays, but I think that essays are hard to write when you're younger. I think you have to get to a certain point where you have a kind of confidence that comes with a little bit of age, and I'm not at all sure it isn't just, I just think it's very hard. When I was at the Post, at one point they asked me if I wanted to be a columnist there, and they gave me 3 weeks to write a column, and I really had trouble doing it. Could not do it. Now I could do it. When I was 30, I could do it. But I couldn't do it at the age of 27 when they asked me to do it. And that's another point I want to make, is that if there's something you want to write, and when you sit down to write it you have trouble doing it, it doesn't mean you're not going to someday be able to do it. It just means that you might not be ready yet. The women's movement really changed the lives of almost everybody that I knew, and at a certain point, I had pretty much behaved about it the way I had behaved about most things as a reporter. In fact, the first collection of pieces that I published as a book was called Wallflower at the Orgy. And I thought that it was a perfect metaphor for what a reporter really is, because you know, I was always at some fabulous event where people were laughing and having sex, and I was on the side writing in my notebook. And when the women's movement came along, I sort of took that attitude toward it, and it became fairly clear to me that journalism was a way of avoiding something that wasn't necessarily good to avoid. And Esquire asked me at a certain point if I wanted to write a column. In fact, they asked me if I wanted to write a column about movies, and it was a horrifying thought for many, many reasons. And I said no, and they got sort of cross and said, well, what do you want to write about? And I said, well, I'd kind of like to write about women. And I loved being able to do that. I loved sort of going to various things that women were doing in that period, from things that were fairly serious feminist issues to things like the Pillsbury Bake Off, and writing personally about them, and in a way that wasn't detached at all, really saying how I felt about them. And I was writing about myself much, much more. And that was something that I had really learned, I think, from my mother, who always used to say this unbelievably irritating thing to us when we were growing up, which was, everything is copy. You know, almost anything that happened to us that was horrible, we would come to her and tell her, and she would say, everything is copy. And it was sort of like, I know you feel terrible about it, parentheses, and I feel terrible too, and I don't want to hear any more about it. But someday you'll be able to write about it, and you will turn it into something else. And I used to hear this and think, oh, right, what am I going to turn this horrible episode into? But of course, she turned out to be absolutely right where I was concerned. And she also, I think, taught me what I think is a fundamental lesson of humor, which is that if you slip on a banana peel, people laugh at you. But if you tell people you slipped on a banana peel, it's your joke, and you're the hero of it. And that was a kind of fantastic lesson to learn, and it's one of the things that I wish everybody would learn, because it makes life much, much easier in the long run, and it certainly makes it easier to write about yourself. I wrote a piece for Esquire in that period called A Few Words About Breasts, which some of you may remember. And I have made enough money from that piece, and which has been reprinted 1 trillion times, to have bought myself many, many, many breasts if I had wanted them. But of course, writing about it is also a way of, Joan Didion once said, I write to find out what I think. And there is no question that the act of writing forces you to come to conclusions that you don't necessarily have to come to if you're just kind of walking down the street. And anyway, at a certain point when I was a magazine writer, things had this way of sort of passing over New York and blighting everyone with their power. There was a year when the Sideburn ferry flew over New York and all the men suddenly had, and there was a year when Vitello Tornado flew over New York, and of course there was the famous year when divorce flew over New York and everyone got divorced, everyone. But one of the things that definitely flew over New York was the screenplay thing. Everybody was sort of writing screenplays. Everyone was trying to move laterally. And I remember when we were at Esquire, we had a cover of a monkey writing a screenplay. I mean, it was, everyone wanted to get into the movie business. And I don't know that I desperately wanted to get into the movie business in any way, because I was pretty happy as a magazine writer. But I was sort of on the fringes of Watergate. I was, in fact, a bride of Watergate, because I was living with and then married to Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein, and I heard a lot of stuff. And here was the thing I heard. Okay, this is not a true story, but this was a little Watergate story that kept kind of going around. It was a rumor. And the rumor was that Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, who had been convicted of being a bad person and was in jail, wanted to be pardoned by President Nixon. And so the Teamsters put $600,000 in a suitcase and gave it to Maurice Stans, who was the head of the committee to reelect the president and one of the sort of Watergate minor figures. They delivered this money to Maurice Stans in the Pierre Hotel in New York. He put it in the Pierre Hotel safe. That night, the Pierre Hotel safe was robbed. They took the suitcase, but Nixon still had to pardon Jimmy Hoffa because he had received the bribe. And it was just one of those delicious stories that you kind of hear and you think, oh, that's sort of a great plot for something, especially if it was the Teamsters who robbed the money out of the safe, because it's a perfect crime. You commit you bribe the president, you steal the money so there's no proof. The bribe works. It's cost you nothing, So I kind of tucked it in the back of my head as a plot. Now, up till that moment, almost everything in my life was, I would think of, whatever I would say, I would think, oh, that would make a good newspaper article. Or then when I was a magazine writer, I would make a good magazine piece. Then when I was a columnist, I would think that would make a good column. This was the first thing I thought, this would make a movie. And someone said to me, did I want to write a women's caper film? And I thought, well, that's good. I've got the plot. Now I just have to put women into it. Now, how did I know how to write a screenplay at all? This is an even shabbier story. This is a shabby story. I haven't told you anything as shabby as I'm about to tell you. When All the President's Men was being made into a movie, the first draft of the screenplay was delivered to Bob and Carl. And they weren't happy with it. And they sat down, they were very unhappy. And Carl said, maybe we should take a crack at it. So Carl and I sat down and rewrote William Goldman's screenplay. Terrible thing to do. And William Goldman did not speak to me for many, many years because of it. But anyway, I think I learned how to write a screenplay from rewriting William Goldman's script, because he's a wonderful screenwriter and he knows how to do things very, very economically. He's really sort of state-of-the-art screenwriter in terms of very, very short scenes. I don't happen to write a lot of short scenes in my screenplays, but I saw how he did this. I saw how I began to learn so much about some of the rules of screenplays, which is that you almost never bring anyone in a door or take them out a door as you might in a play. People enter and exit in plays. They don't in movies. You just come right into the thing, and they don't have to say very much to get across who they are. And of course, one of the best things about screenplays is you don't really have to know very much about, not like a novel, you don't have to know who the people are you're writing about. You just have to kind of know how they talk and what they might be talking about. You might know who they are, but you don't have to know who they are. And I remember once reading a writer named Harry Crews. I don't know if any of you, but Harry Crews once gave an interview where he said, I don't think he had really taken any writing courses or had much of an education, but he had learned to write because he read Moby Dick and he thought it was a great book. So he typed it 5 times. And I don't mean to compare William Goldman to Melville or even me to Harry Crews, but I just want to say that you can learn, I think, quite a lot about the rhythm of a certain form by putting it through what we used to call the typewriter. And so anyway, I wrote this women's caper movie. And it was bought for television. And it was made, and it was really bad. I'm not exaggerating. It was one of the worst things. In fact, I saw it on television a couple of years ago, and I thought, I'm just going to watch this because it can't possibly be as bad as I remember it. It was even worse. But the script wasn't terrible, which was why it had gotten made at all. I mean, you'll find this hard to believe, but sometimes things that aren't good movies really had pretty good scripts. And this had a pretty good script, and people had read it. So I began getting assignments to do movies, and it was kind of interesting to me. First of all, I had just had a child, and so I couldn't really go off and do a lot. I didn't want to go off and do a lot of long reporting pieces for magazines because I had a baby. And I was writing screenplays, and I didn't know how to do them. And that was fantastically exciting because I was now in my 40s, well, almost in my 40s. But the point is that it's really very interesting when you sort of know how to write one thing to have to learn to write another thing. You're suddenly on this learning curve that you haven't been on in a little while, because what can often happen to you with almost any form is that you have this kind of faint, haven't I done this before, going through your head. And suddenly, when you're doing a screenplay, when I was doing a screenplay, I really had no idea what I was doing. But the money was pretty good. And then I got divorced. And then the money really looked very good, because there's nothing like divorce to make you think about money. And and I wrote about 6 screenplays. And I think it was the 7th that was made. The first movie that I had made was Silkwood. And I wrote that with Alice Arlen, and the whole time I was working on these screenplays, I was also writing a novel that was sort of about the end of my marriage called Heartburn. It's one of those novels that people always use the word thinly disguised in reference to. And for the whole time I was doing these screenplays, I was sort of thinking, well, I'll write this screenplay for X number of months, and then I'll have enough money to finish my novel. And so I did that for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, I had a novel and I had a movie being made. And I had enough money that I could now go back to that thing we call real writing if I'd wanted to. I didn't have to go on writing the movies. I'd made a little bit of money on the novel. But I didn't want to go back to real writing because I was so interested in movies, because as interesting as it had been to write scripts, it was really interesting to have a movie made. I'd never been through that process. I'd never been on a set for my script. I had never been part of the collaborative experience that can sometimes be horrible, but can sometimes be very, very interesting. And Alice and I worked with Mike Nichols on Silkwood, and Mike is almost all directors have their own way of working with scripts. Mike has this kind of faintly psychoanalytic method, which is that you sort of sit around. I don't know what your experience was, Jules, but probably not too dissimilar. We kind of sit around and free associate, and maybe you have an idea and maybe it goes in, but maybe he didn't work on your script at all because it was perfect. Who knows? Talk about adult movies, carnal knowledge, however. So you'd kind of sit around for days at a time, kind of like at a shrink's, where you think, is this getting us anywhere? And then something would actually end up being worth putting into the script. And we began working on this script of Silkwood, and Meryl Streep was going to be in it, so it was very exciting. And one day, I have to tell you something first. The reason Mike was available to direct Silkwood was that he had been betrayed. He had been collaborating with a writer that we will call Jane Doe, okay, on the Broadway version of La Cage aux Folles. And they had been working together for months and months, and there was a composer and a lyricist, and at a certain point there was some argument over money or something, and they tossed Mike overboard. And he felt that he had been betrayed by Jane Doe, who was a very close friend of his. So now Alice and Mike and I are in the room working on the script of Silkwood. And for those of you who don't remember or didn't see it, Karen Silkwood worked at a nuclear plant in Oklahoma, and she lived in a house with her boyfriend and with a girlfriend who was played by Cher in the movie. And when she began concerned that there were safety violations, everyone in her life turned against her to various degrees. And Mike became obsessed with this woman friend, played by Cher eventually, who had turned against Karen Silkwood. And he started coming up with insane ideas of ways that she could betray Karen. And I mean, there was going to be writing in lipstick on the wall of the ladies' room, and just things that hadn't happened. And I still had a kind of journalist's hat on at this moment, and I was still, and I believe, by the way, that when you do a movie that is based on something that happened, you can't just make everything up. You just can't. I mean, it really makes me nuts when something like A Beautiful Mind gets done, which has a great story, and then they hook it up with stuff that didn't happen. You don't have to do that. So I was kind of sitting there getting more and more cross, and finally I said, as he came up with yet another insane idea, I said, Mike, Jane Doe did not kill Karen Silkwood. And you're trying to get her to have done it. And Mike started laughing, and he told me, he told me and Alice this great little game, which is another game worth playing when you're waiting for a table. And that is this. Okay, it's a riddle. And it's not a riddle, it's a story. A man and a woman live in a house on a deserted peninsula. And the man goes away on a business trip, and his mother comes to stay. One day, the woman takes a ferry over to the mainland to see her lover. And she and her lover make love, and when it's over, it's very late, and she wakes up, jumps out of bed, races to the ferry, and discovers that the last ferry has left for the night. So she says to the ferry boat captain, please, please take me back over to the peninsula. And he says, I'll take you for 6 times the normal ferry fare. And she says, I don't have it. And he says, too bad. So she has to walk home, and on the way, she is raped and killed. And here's the question. Who killed her, and in what order are they responsible for her death? The woman, the husband, the ferry boat captain, the lover, the rapist, or the mother-in-law? Now, this is a fantastic little Rorschach test, and how people answer always tells a great deal about how they feel about marriage, mothers-in-law, personal responsibility, blah, 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 blah. But I just love the story because the same thing was true with Karen Silkwood. Who killed her? And in what order? Karen, her boyfriend who walked out on her, her girlfriend who definitely ratted her out to the company at some point, the union that sent her into this company to spy on her coworkers when she really wasn't mature enough to do that, the company which ran a terrible plant and was really irresponsible, or the driver of the car. Did I say the driver of the car? The point is, you know, I thought, oh, this is great. And it was a little while later, I don't know how long later, but it was a little while later that I realized that that moment was as much of a light bulb for me as I had had with my journalism teacher. It was the moment I realized that there was a thing called the story. There was a thing called how you tell the story. And it isn't about the truth, because the way you tell the story is, you know, it's just such a delicious question. Can there ever be a truth if it's a story? Can a story ever be true, really true? Because it's always narrative. Edgar Doctorow once wrote that he believed that there is no difference between fiction and nonfiction. There's only narrative. And what he meant is that everything is a story. And in my kind of naivete as a girl reporter, it really didn't cross my mind that even in this, you know, even when I was covering 2 hooded seals at the Coney Island Aquarium, I was telling a story. I was not just writing the facts, you know, I was not being objective, all these kind of deluded ideas that journalists have about themselves. So that was really the moment when I think I began to leave whatever journalism was in my life and go into this other world, which is called, why would you ever want to just rely on the truth when you could make up such a better ending to something, you know? You know, why would you ever want to write what you actually said when you now have a moment to say the thing you wish you had said? So this was something that just was kind of dancing around in my head. And as I began, you know, learning about movies and learning what movies were, and, you know, I always say that writing a screenplay for a movie is like you know, that pizza, the plain one, with just cheese and tomatoes. And when you're the screenwriter, that's the pizza you deliver. And your hope is that the director will love your pizza and commit to it. What the director usually says is, I love this pizza, if they like it, but I wish it had mushrooms on it. And you say, just exactly what I meant to do, even though you really didn't. And you put mushrooms on it, and then the costume designer comes and says it needs peppers, and the production designer puts anchovies on it. And when it's done, you have a pizza with everything, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes you want to shoot yourself because you should never have put the peppers on it. And why didn't you lie down in traffic to do that? But then sometimes it works. And when we did When Harry Met Sally, when I did it with Rob Reiner, that was, for me, a pizza that really worked. And, you know, another thing I always say to screenwriters is, if you want a director to commit to your script, put his last divorce into it. And Rob actually, it wasn't his last divorce, but it was Rob's idea. Rob had an idea for When Harry Met Sally, which is two people become friends at the end of the first significant relationships of their lives, and they make a decision not to have sex because it will ruin the relationship, and then they have sex and it ruins the relationship. That was what he said to me one day at a meeting, and I said, I'm there. I know what this movie is. I know exactly what to do about it. Actually, I really did. I had not only had a similar experience to that, you know, I'd certainly made the mistake of trying to convert a relationship from friendship to sex. And, but I also thought it was a chance to write about being single in New York, that it was almost a way of writing an essay as a movie. And I cleverly based the character of Harry on Rob so that he would become even more connected to this script. But he's a great comic character, and he was very depressed because he was divorced, and he was in love with his depression. It was like his favorite pet, and he carried it everywhere. And I loved that idea. I loved how gloomy he was and how funny he was and how he knew he was being funny when he was being gloomy. And I interviewed him and Andy Scheinman, the producer, and put all their secrets about being men into the script. And then one day they said to me, well, you know, we've told you our secrets. Tell us something about women that we don't know. So I said, okay, women fake orgasms. And they said, not with me. And I said, oh, yes, all women at one time or another, even with you. And they really didn't believe it. It was a kind of fabulous moment. And Rob went stamping, you know, Rob is very loud, and went stamping out into the office and called all the women in and asked them all if they had ever faked an orgasm. They all said they had. That was very shocking. And so we sort of took a scene that had been a scene about a date that Harry had had and added sort of the gist of this, of what I've just told you, to it. And then we had a reading of the script, and Meg Ryan said, you know, that this scene would be really good if it took place in a restaurant. And Rob said, oh, that's a good idea. And Billy Crystal said, and I know what the last line of it is. The last line should be a customer in the restaurant saying, I'll have what she's having. And Rob said, and I know the actor to do it, my mother. And, you know, that is one of those things that happen. I mean, that movie, I've seen that movie without the orgasm scene because it was taken out on airplanes. And it's, you know, it really needs that scene. I don't know how to say this. It's not really very good without that scene. But, you know, it was that thing where you just thought, oh, this is collaboration. And Rob, of course, had a completely different style as a director he had come out of television. And unlike Mike, who was a theater director who basically has enormous respect for writers, Rob is mainly only about the joke. How can we make this funny? How can we make this work? How can we make this as funny as possible? I don't mean he has contempt for writers. I mean that there's nothing. You know, when I first started, Patty Chayefsky was everybody's hero, and everyone knew that you weren't allowed to change one word of a Patty Chayefsky script. Well, I can't imagine doing a movie that way. You have to change lines. Things happen, props come up. There are too many exciting accidents that can happen if you have the freedom to change things. And I learned to be very relaxed about that when I worked with Rob. But, of course, you can't always make movies with Mike Nichols and Rob Reiner. And if you want to make movies about women, there aren't very many people who want to direct them because men want to direct things that are pretty much about themselves. So when I started, after I'd had When Harry Met Sally, so I had a hit so I could maybe direct, this project came along, which was the movie that became This Is My Life, based on a wonderful book by Meg Wolitzer called This Is Your Life. And, you know, it was about a woman who was a stand-up comic, who was a single mother, who lived in New York. And, well, you know, I was the perfect person to direct it. Who else is going to want to direct this movie? And she used her life as copy. Everything just fit right in. And I think another reason I wanted to direct is that Hollywood doesn't like it when you get old. And right around the time I was going to direct This Is My Life, I had done a script for Warner Brothers, and I had a meeting with the executive, and he said, well, you know, you're not really going to be available to do a rewrite on this. How would you feel if we brought a younger, hipper writer in? And it was an interesting moment because I was, at the time, I think I was 49, and it was like, you know, do not ask for whom the bell tolls. And I thought, well, it's a good thing I'm becoming a director because at least I can go on being a writer because I can write and then direct it. And so, you know, suddenly in my 50s, I was a director, which is something I never, ever expected to be. And that was something I really, really didn't know very much about. I'm kind of ashamed to look at some of the things I didn't know anything about. I still don't think I'm at the top of the learning curve on that one, but I know a lot more about directing than I certainly knew at the beginning. And it's a wonderful job. And I'm going to move along here, but if anyone wants to ask questions. But now I just do want to say that I also, for the first time in my life, at the age of, really horrible age, about a year ago, I suddenly had an idea. I suddenly had an idea for something that was a play. And it was the first time in my life I had ever thought, oh, this could be a play. I've always been a little mystified about what a play was. In fact, my internist once told me a great story about being up in his house in Westchester County and getting a phone call from a civil liberties lawyer asking if his cottage was free. And it was free. And an hour later, the lawyer arrived with Alexander Goodenough, who had just defected from the Bolshoi Ballet, with Harold, what's his name, Brodsky. No. Joseph Brodsky. Sorry, Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet. They had just defected. No one knew. They put them in my internist's cottage. My internist was having a dinner party. He wasn't allowed to tell any of the guests why these two madmen were having hysterics a few feet from the house, and he told me the story, and I said, you know, you are the only person I know that a play happened to, you know? I mean, he was in a summer house. I'm sure there were French doors, you know. I didn't get into that, but, and for years I had thought, you know, what is a play? How do you do a play? And then I'd been thinking for a while about Mary McCarthy and Lillian Hellman and the terrible fight they had with one another and the lawsuit that came out of it, and how could I work with that? And I thought maybe it's a television miniseries, blah, blah, blah. And somebody said to me one day, well, could it be a play? And I said, well, I don't see how it could be a play because they were almost never together. And then I thought, but now they are, because they're both dead. And in some horrible way, these two women who hated each other are stuck together forever. And what if they met in a ladies' room in hell? And I went home and said to my husband, I had an idea today. What do you think of this? And he said, that's a good idea. So anyway, it's opening on Broadway December 12th. How about that? So now I get to be on my little list of playwright too. And anyway, that's the end of that. And please ask me some questions, and thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you for calling me. Thank you. Right.
I can't say I'm your biggest fan because I don't know everybody else, but I'm certainly a fan.
Thank you.
Cooked from heartburn, used wallflower, do what you all the time to know it was yours. And can't say the word arugula without saying it's a vegetable. And what I was wondering was, how much influence did Wise Guys have on My Blue Heaven? Was there a correlation?
This is my husband, Nick Pileggi, who wrote the book Wise Guy, which became the movie Goodfellas, is based on a mafioso named Henry Hill, who at the end of Goodfellas goes into the federal witness program. And it is absolutely true that I stole all of My Blue Heaven from what happened to him after he went into the federal witness program, because they sent him to Redmond, Washington, the bicycle capital of America, where you could not get a decent red sauce. And he single-handedly started a crime wave there. First of all, they arrested him for jaywalking, which was a crime in Redmond. And he was constantly getting into trouble, and then he married someone while he was still married to his wife, and everything he did was a nightmare for the FBI, which finally gave up on him, and now he's, you know, now they've just given up completely. He's out there, but nobody cares about killing him anymore. All the people who might have wanted to kill him are dead anyway, but anyway, I was inspired by that, and well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
Better say something important now. Everybody's listening. You had talked about not being ready to write certain things at certain times in your life. For example, writing a column when you were at the New York Post, or initially when you went to Esquire. And I'm wondering if there are certain things that one could do to get oneself ready to write something that they might not write, or just to keep writing and hopefully get it, have the light bulb go off. And
Well, I don't know the answer to that, except that I just think you should write what you can write. And then after you can write that, you'll probably be able to write the next thing, whatever it is. I mean, what you should not, you know, what you should beware of is trying to write, let's say, a novel set in Renaissance Italy for your first book. Do you know what I mean? I mean, try not to set the bar so high that you feel that you've failed. And you know, that's one reason why I always say to people that journalism is such great training for any kind of writing, because you just keep writing and writing and writing. And if you can get a job at any newspaper, so that you don't become afraid of writing. I think, by the way, that a lot of people are less afraid of writing than some of my contemporaries because of email. I think email has made people better at being able to put their own voice into, I think my mother used to say, and I'm fairly sure she was quoting someone famous like George Bernard Shaw, the best way to learn to write is to write a letter to your mother and cut off the dear mom. And there's an element of that to email. You're writing to people that you're either good enough friends with that you're relaxed with them, or you have no idea who they are and you're relaxed with them because they don't know who you are. And that's very helpful. But all I'm saying is write what you can and keep doing it. And if you're writing something and you come to a stop in it, don't delude yourself that you have the dreaded writer's block. I can't bear this word. I mean, one of the great things about journalism is you don't get to have writer's block. You get fired if you have writer's block. But many people just get to a point on a project where they're a little written out on it. And what they need is to go off and recharge. So go write something else. But don't think, I'm blocked, I can't do anything. Go find something else to do with your fingers while you're letting this other thing percolate. Because especially with novels, with Heartburn, if I had written that whole novel in the number of days it took me to write it, I would have written it in about 9 months. Instead, I wrote it in 3-month blocks over a 3-year period, or a 2-year period, actually. And I could never have written it straight through. It was great that I got to stop and write a screenplay. And then when I came back to it, I'd sort of thought of a whole bunch of other things I wanted to stick into it, which doesn't mean that's how you are going to write your novel when you write your novel. If you write your novel, I'm just saying that, write what you can. If you can't write what you can. Do you know what I'm saying? I think. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You're a fabulous role model for me, and I admire you tremendously. Your flexibility and willingness to learn, and also to get over whatever your willingness to take on and try something new and test out your voice and let go of fear. That's what I heard from you and from what you said. And I also want to ask you a question about Heartburn.
Yeah.
The Alistair Cook scene, which sticks with me. How did that occur to you, and how did you get him to do it?
Oh, it wasn't Alistair Cook who did it.
It wasn't.
Oh, no. It was, I always forget this English actor's name. This wonderful English actor named John somebody or other did it. Alistair Cook would not do it. He did not think it was funny.
Okay.
But it's just a scene. I don't know how I thought of it. I just thought, it came out of, I'll tell you how I did think of it. Actually, I do remember how I thought of it. At least I'll tell you what I know got me there is that when my marriage was ending and I was pregnant and miserable and really and betrayed in this unbelievably, I knew at the time it was funny, that it would someday be funny. I just was not laughing at all, And in fact, before my marriage broke up, the man who was married to the woman my husband was sleeping with, who was the British ambassador to the United States, who was a man who always thought of important things, called me up one day and suggested that we meet. This was the first I knew that he knew. And I said, where should we meet? And he suggested a restaurant at the very way up Connecticut Avenue, that Chinese place we all used to go to. Do you remember what was it? Whatever. And I said, we don't have to hide. We're not the ones having the affair. And anyway, so we meet in front of this restaurant. We fall into each other's arms. I burst into tears. He burst into tears. I said to him, oh, isn't this awful? Isn't it just awful? And he said, it's awful. What's happening to this country? And, you know, that's a moment you think, okay, I'm just going to try to remember that, you know. Not because I thought I was going to write something about it, not because I was thinking everything is copy, but partly because one of the great lessons my mother taught me in the course of teaching me to own my own story is that at least, you know, it's funny and maybe I can make someone laugh, and that's good, because that's what I do. That's the thing I do. Anyway, the point is that in exactly this period, I got a call from one of the studios which was trying to make the movie a remake of The Women. And I had never seen The Women. And I went over to the AFI in Washington to look at it, and I'm sitting there in the midst of this horrible marital crisis. And as you may remember, the movie begins with I can't remember the actress, Mary Astor or somebody, but she's having her nails done at the beauty parlor, and the manicurist tells her that the woman over there is having an affair with her husband. And I thought, oh, this is unbelievable. Is it possible for me to go anywhere and not be reminded of this? So that's what I did with the scene in Heartburn where she turns on the television set, and just about everything on television is about her betrayal, divorce, etc. And it was just coming out of what you feel at a time like that, which is that, you know, this is the most important thing on the earth and everything reminds me of it. So that's where it came from. So, yeah, back there, get that microphone to the back. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you're reading anything or have read anything recently that knocks your socks off.
Well, I'm reading this book everyone is reading called Lovely Bones, I think it's called, The Lovely Bones. It's pretty great, but so I'm reading that now. But I'm sorry to report that for the last month, before I started reading this, I got hooked on a thing called Scrabble Blitz. And I stopped reading for about a month. So now I'm trying to wean myself away from it. It's really bad. Yeah.
Many years ago, you wrote in one of your Esquire columns, I'm sorry, Danielle. Many years ago, you wrote in one of your Esquire columns that it took you a ream of paper to write the lead for the column. Are you using less paper these days?
Oh, well, I mean, that was just a way of, I mean, I'm a very fast typist, and when in my early years as a writer, I used to just, whenever, this is, by the way, a thing I used to do when I used to get to a point in a story where I couldn't go any further, is I would just type the whole story all over again. And I'm a really fast typist. Of course, this is before computers, and computers have you kind of feel like an idiot if you do that with a computer. But I always felt that writing and typing were very connected things, and that sometimes the only way you got a new idea for a sentence was by kind of approaching it all over again. And I used to do it partly in the hopes that I would be typing so fast when I got to the part where it ended that I would just be catapulted into the next paragraph. But I don't write that much prose anymore, you know, I don't. I do like to retype often on screenplays, or, you know, it's kind of nice to come in and retype what you did the day before to kind of just do a little polishing. But I do a lot of polishing. You know, screenplays in many ways are so nice to work on a computer, because you can add a sentence or a word in a way that sometimes, you know, just the thought that adding a word meant you had to retype the whole page really was a kind of... On the other hand, everybody is writing screenplays on computers now, and screenplays are worse than ever, so it doesn't seem that computers are creating better screenplays, including mine, so... That's it? Well... Okay, thank you for coming.
the Screenplay.